Hi, this is Phil Candreva. The first working capital fund video you watched was a primer. It provided you the principles and operating concepts of the working capital fund. Here we discuss rate setting and financial management. The primer ended with this slide. Let's elaborate on budget formulation and execution. This is an actual budget from the FY 2015 Navy budget for one of the research and development centers. Since it's the FY15 budget, it was submitted in early fiscal year 14, and so we report the fiscal year 13 actual results. And we see that this command had revenue of $4 billion, expenses of almost $4 billion, with a result of $10 million to the good. And the year ended with an accumulated operating result of $17 million. So if they earned 10 but ended up with 17, that means they must have begun FY13 with $7.1 million of accumulated operating result. Recall also that the goal of the budget is to end with an AOR of 0. To get to an AOR of 0 in the budget year, we need to estimate what the results will be in the current year, because when that FY15 budget is submitted, we're only about 3 or 4 months into fiscal year 14. So the estimate is that fiscal year 14 will end with an AOR of $29 million. So therefore, we will budget or plan to lose the $29 million in the FY15 budget, bringing us to our goal of an accumulated operating result of 0. How do we do that? Well, there's some math involved. There are a number of variables and terms and mathematical relationships that we need to take a look at. That stabilized rate that we charge our customers is set in this budgeting process, and it's expressed in dollars per some unit of output. The revenue the working capital fund earns is that rate times the amount of output. And the amount of output are the number of units sold. Frequently, that's something like labor hours or a work day. Cost are the obligations incurred by the working capital fund, either citing the customer funds directly or the working capital, and this includes all of our direct, indirect, and overhead costs. In the budgeting process, we're going to establish a unit cost goal, which is the budgeted cost to deliver each unit of output, and we use this for the rate setting. Our unit cost is the actual cost per unit that we're going to track during execution. So the unit cost goal is forward-looking and an estimate of costs. The unit cost is backward-looking and is our actual costs. And as we manage during the year of execution, we're going to be comparing these two numbers to see if we're hitting our target. Net operating result is the financial performance for a given year, or the revenue minus the cost. The accumulated operating result is the net sum of all prior year NORs, or if you remember from the primer, this is the level of funding in the tank. And then BOY is the beginning of the year, EOY is the end of the year. So let's take these variables and terms and look at some important formulas. Right? The unit cost goal, as we said, is our budgeted cost divided by our budgeted output. Our unit cost is our actual cost divided by our actual output. Budgeted cost is the sum, that estimated cost to sell the budgeted number of outputs. So we start with the customer demand. How much output do you demand from us? And then compute how much it will cost to deliver that demand. The rate that we charge needs to capture that unit cost goal and adjust for our accumulated operating result. So we're going to take our accumulated operating result and divide it by that budgeted output, because if we are, like we saw in that earlier example, we needed to lose $29 million. We want to take that $29 million, divide it by the number of units we intend to sell, subtract that from our unit cost goal, so we're losing a little bit of money with every hour that we sell in order to achieve that target. Sometimes we might want to make money, in which case if the AOR is negative, we're going to add a little bit of money to each unit in order to make a little bit of money. And we'll look at a specific example of this in a minute. Revenue is that stabilized rate times our actual output. Our net operating result, again, revenue minus actual cost. Our beginning of the year AOR plus our NOR gives us our end of the year AOR. Right? We started with 10, we earned 3, we end with 13. If we substitute the NOR formula in that expression, we have the beginning of the year AOR plus our revenue minus our cost gives us our end of the year AOR. Gives us the same figure. We could then substitute the revenue equation and say that our beginning of the year AOR plus the rate times our output minus the cost to deliver that output is our end of the year AOR. On a homework problem, you may be given some or all of these numbers, and so having these formulas can be helpful in understanding these relationships and solving the homework problem. All right, so let's apply some of this. Imagine we have a working capital fund activity that performs some service and sells that service at an hourly rate. There are 1,000 employees, of which 850 bill their time to customers directly. The rest are indirect or overhead employees. And we can assume in this example that our annual workload is stable. That is, those 850 billable employees represents the amount of customer demand. Now, those 850 people, they work, or there are 2,088 work hours in a year, but they get sick, they take leave, they go to mandatory training, there's the all-hands event where it would be inappropriate to charge a customer. So let's assume on average they can bill 1,800 hours to a customer out of those 2,088. That tells us then that the command has a capacity, or if you assume workload is stable, that there's a customer demand for a little more than 1.5 million hours of work from this organization. So let's figure out the unit cost goal. The unit cost goal, again, is the budgeted cost divided by the budgeted output. So what does it cost for all of these people? Let's assume for the 1,000 people, including fringe benefits and salaries, that totals $120 million. And the command has a number of other expenses: security, janitorial, supplies, maintenance, and so on. That total another $63.6 million. So their total cost, $183,600,000. The unit cost goal is that budgeted cost divided by the budgeted output. We divide the 1.5 million hours into that cost, and it gives us a unit cost goal of $120 an hour. This becomes the basis for the rate that's charged. But again, it's not the rate. Why not? Well, recall that the objective of the budget is to drive the AOR in the budget year to 0. So assume this command completed last year with an AOR of positive $700,000. And they estimate at the end of the current year the AOR will be a little higher, 1.1 million. That means they want to charge a rate a little lower than the unit cost goal to result in a negative NOR equivalent to their estimated beginning of the year AOR. So we take our costs, we subtract the $1.1 million divided by the number of hours we're going to sell, and that gives us a stabilized rate of $119.28 an hour. Remember, the unit cost goal was 120. This is a little lower, 119, because the goal is to lose some money. So let's talk about a hypothetical execution of that budget. So let's assume business was more brisk than we expected. And instead of selling 1,530,000 hours, we sold 1,600,000 hours. And there's a number of different ways that could happen. Our employees could be more productive, they worked some overtime, and so on. Our revenue then is our rate times our output. Our rate we were charging was $119.28. We sold 1.6 million hours. That means we brought in $190 million. Now let's also assume the command's costs grew roughly in proportion with this added business. Remember, our earlier cost estimate was $183 million. Let's say it costs $189 million because we did more business than we expected. So what then is our actual unit cost? Well, given this information, the unit cost is actual cost divided by actual output. We now have those numbers. The actual cost was $189 million. We actually sold 1.6 million hours. That gives us a unit cost of $118.13. So this command had a unit cost that is less than its unit cost goal. Well, that's admirable, right? Things cost less than people expected. They provided good value for their customer. It also had a unit cost lower than its rate. That means it will have a positive NOR. Things actually cost less than what they charge the customer on an hourly basis. But wait a minute, didn't they want a negative NOR? What happened here? Well, let's look at that NOR. We take revenue minus actual cost, gives us an NOR of $1,848,000. Now, when the budget was built, the command estimated last year they would end with an AOR of 1.1 million. So they had an NOR target of negative 1.1 million. But they ended up 2.9 million in the other direction, right? They wanted to go negative 1, they ended up positive almost 2. So what drove this reversal of fortune? Well, by selling those extra 70,000 hours, remember they budgeted 1,530,000 and they sold 1.6 million. They earned an additional $119 per hour times those 70,000 hours. So they brought in 8 million more in revenue than they anticipated. And because our budget's comprised of both variable costs, those that increase in proportion to the work, and fixed costs stay the same regardless of the amount of work, when they sold more hours than budgeted, they earned more than they needed to cover those fixed costs. And so a planned loss turned into a gain. Now, if the opposite had happened, let's say they sold 1.4 million hours, they probably would have had a bigger loss than anticipated because they would not have brought in enough revenue to cover all of the fixed costs. So we end up with this net operating result of $1.8 million. So where does our AOR stand at this point? Well, when they built the budget, they thought they would begin the year with an AOR of 1.1 million. But that was early in fiscal year 14. There were still 9 months or so to go. Let's assume they actually ended last year with an AOR of 750,000. So their final AOR position is the beginning AOR plus the NOR. Or they began the year at 750, they earned 1.8 million, so now their AOR is $2,598,000. One thing we haven't talked about yet is the notion of capital improvement within the working capital fund. Under this principle of full cost recovery, the working capital fund invests in capital purchases and passes those costs on to the customers. But because these purchases benefit future periods, it would really be unfair to charge all of the customers of the current year a big expense and have the customers of future years benefit from that big expense. And so what we do is we depreciate the cost and pass that cost on to the customers over the useful life of that thing. So for example, if we bought a suite of software for $250,000 with an estimated useful life of 5 years, we will pass on 1/5 of that cost each year to the customers who are benefiting from that software, and we'll recover $50,000 a year for the next 5 years to fully recover the investment in the software. Well, let's look at a couple of questions to review what we've covered here. Here's our first question. A working capital fund activity has been in existence for 5 years. Over that time, it has experienced annual net operating results as follows. I'll give you a few minutes to figure out what is the activity's current accumulated operating result. At the end of year 1, they had earned $20,000, so their AOR is 20,000. Year 2, they lost 30, bringing them to negative 10. They gained 12, bringing them to positive 2, earned 4, raising that to 6, and then lost 13, so their current accumulated operating result, or the net sum of all prior year net operating results, is negative 7,000. If the actual unit cost exceeds the unit cost goal, what must be true? Think about that for a minute. What must be true is C. The true cost or actual cost per unit were higher than budgeted. The question's only asking about unit costs. So our total costs, we don't have enough information to know that. And while selling fewer or more may have driven this result, we don't know if that's the case. So the only thing that we know must be true is that the true cost per unit were higher than budgeted. Next question. If FY15 actual costs are 1.2 million and outputs are 10,000 units and revenue is 1,250,000, what was the stabilized rate? Remember, rate or revenue, say, which is the same as sales, is your rate times your output. So your rate must be sales divided by output. 1.25 million divided by 10,000 is $125 per unit. So what was the unit cost? We know the formula for unit cost is actual cost divided by actual output, so our unit cost was $120. What was the NOR? Well, NOR is cost divided by, or sales rather, divided by cost, or $50,000. You could also get there by realizing that your unit cost was $5 less than your rate. So for every unit you sold, you gained $5. So you could have taken that $5 times the 10,000 units and got to 50,000 that way as well. So what was the unit cost goal? Well, we don't have enough information to know that. The unit cost goal is your budgeted cost divided by your budgeted output, and the only information we have on this slide are actuals. So let's end with a couple of management concerns regarding a working capital fund. One of them is, what happens if you have insufficient demand or excessive demand? Working capital fund tends to work well in a stable environment. If there is a drop in demand, cost per unit will go up because you have to spread those fixed costs over smaller units. When that happens, your rate goes up. When the rate goes up, customers will demand less, and you end up in this downward spiral. The opposite could occur. There could be a dramatic increase in demand, such as Transcom experienced back in 2003 when we were mobilizing the force to go to Iraq. They delivered far more transportation services than anticipated. In that case, they will earn excessive revenue, more than cover their fixed costs, at the expense of the customer's appropriations. In those cases, sometimes DoD leadership needs to intervene. We may reprogram money, change rates in the middle of the year, or take some other extraordinary action. Second thought, in the long run, all costs are variable. So if you're managing an activity that's facing a long-term change, it would be prudent to look at those fixed costs and see which ones should be altered. I was comptroller at a working capital fund activity that was getting smaller, and we occupied 1.5 buildings, and we put a plan together to get out of one of those buildings in order to reduce those fixed costs over time. The next thing that is sometimes an issue is the economics of marginal cost. If you apply all of these costs to, say, labor, and you have a lot of capital expenses, these capital expenses are passed to the customer through labor. And so an activity that has a lot of labor and doesn't use much capital, such as painting, for instance, you would charge more than what a market rate would be. But if you had an activity that used a lot of capital and very little labor, you would probably be undercharging for that service compared to the private sector. And sometimes in competitive environments, the working capital fund may be at a disadvantage because we base everything on average cost rather than marginal cost. And lastly is the issue of carryover. A working capital fund activity needs to make sure that there is enough work in progress as the fiscal year transitions to keep everybody employed and charging customers until the new orders come in. Otherwise, if those billable employees are not able to directly charge a customer, they become part of overhead, and it hurts the operating result for the year. The first video talked about basic principles and operating concepts. This video went into the mathematics of rate setting and execution management. We can discuss more of this in class.